In 1975, Microsoft was founded on one simple, audacious promise: a computer on every desk, in every home, running Microsoft software. It wasn't a slogan dreamed up by a marketing department years later. It was the actual founding mission, the thing the entire company was built to chase from day one. And for nearly 50 years, that promise came true almost exactly as written. Windows became the default, not one option among several. The assumption: if you were building a computer for a regular person to use, Windows was simply what went on it, the same way wheels just go on a car. The promise is quietly falling apart right now. Not through a dramatic collapse, not through some single headline event you'd have seen coming, through something slower and, in a lot of ways, more permanent. A small hardware company out of Colorado that has spent the last 20 years proving one shipped laptop at a time that the every computer running Microsoft software part of that promise was never actually necessary in the first place. Let's start with how completely that founding promise came to dominate the entire personal computing industry, because it didn't happen by accident. It was the result of decades of deliberate strategy. Through the 1990s, as the IBM-compatible PC became the standard hardware platform for the entire industry, Microsoft made sure Windows was the software layer sitting on top of nearly all of it, through licensing deals with manufacturers that made shipping a PC without Windows commercially difficult, and through relentless competition against rival operating systems that mostly ended the same way, Windows absorbing the market. By the time Windows 95 launched, complete with lines of customers waiting outside stores at midnight, and the idea that a computer and a computer running Windows were basically the same thing had settled into the popular imagination so completely that most people never questioned it at all. Software developers built for Windows first because that's where the users were. Hardware manufacturers optimized their drivers for Windows first because that's what their customers expected. That reinforcing cycle? More users meant more software. More software meant more users. Kept Windows' position essentially unchallenged on the desktop for the better part of 3 decades, and it made the founding promise look less like a mission statement and more like an accomplished fact of reality. It's worth spending a moment on where that founding promise actually came from, because the story is more specific and more deliberate than most people realize. Microsoft was founded in 1975, at a moment when personal computers barely existed as a mainstream concept at all. Most computing still happened on room-sized mainframes accessed by a handful of specialists. The founding bet was that computing power was about to become radically smaller, radically cheaper, and radically more personal, and that whoever controlled the software layer running on all of those future personal machines would end up controlling the entire industry that grew up around them. That bet turned out to be almost perfectly correct. Within 20 years, the personal computer had gone from a hobbyist curiosity to a fixture in offices and homes across the world, and Windows was sitting on top of nearly all of it. The founding promise wasn't just a mission statement gathering dust in an old company brochure. It was the literal blueprint the company followed successfully for the better part of half a century. That success is exactly what makes the current moment worth paying attention to. A promise that's been essentially unchallenged. For 50 years, doesn't get treated the same way a 5-year-old business strategy would. It becomes something closer to an assumed law of nature, the kind of thing nobody inside or outside the company seriously questions anymore because it's simply always been true within living memory. That's precisely the kind of deeply embedded assumption that's hardest to notice eroding in real time, and hardest to respond to once enough people finally do notice. Nobody at Microsoft has to formally declare the founding promise obsolete, for it to quietly stop functioning as an unquestioned truth in the minds of a growing number of computer users, IT departments, and even entire governments. There's also something worth noting about the symbolism of exactly who's doing the disproving here. It isn't a giant rival tech company with billions of dollars in competing marketing spend. It's a comparatively tiny, employee-owned hardware maker out of Colorado, without anything close to Microsoft's resources, brand recognition, or market reach. That actually makes the erosion of the founding promise more significant, not less. If a company the size of Google or Apple had built a competing ecosystem to challenge Windows, that would look like ordinary competitive business warfare. Expected, containable, the kind of thing incumbents have playbooks for. Instead, the founding promise is being quietly undercut by a company most people have never heard of, simply by consistently building excellent hardware and never needing Windows to do it. That's a much stranger, much harder threat to fully make sense of, because there's no single rival to point to and compete against directly, just a steadily accumulating pile of evidence that the original promise was never actually necessary. They're not a household name the way Dell or HP or Lenovo is, but this year, in 2026, they just shipped one of the most impressive laptop refreshes of the entire year, and there is not a single line of Windows anywhere in the box. Let's start with what actually just happened, because the specs here matter. And they matter specifically because of what they prove. System 76 just refreshed their Lemur Pro laptop line with Intel's brand new Core Ultra Series 3 Panther Lake processors. The same cutting-edge chip generation flagship Windows laptops are racing to ship this year. The new Lemur Pro comes in both 14-inch and 16-inch configurations, weighs under 3 pounds, and delivers what System 76 is calling the longest battery life of any laptop they've ever built, up to 18 hours on a single charge. It supports up to 32 gigabytes of RAM, up to 4 terabytes of storage, Thunderbolt 4, and Wi-Fi 7. Starting price is $1,999, climbing to just under $2,300 for the flagship configuration. On pure spec sheet terms, this is a premium, top-tier, ultra-portable, fully competitive with anything Windows-based shipping in the same price range this year. And it's not just the Lemur Pro. In the same stretch of 2026, System 76 also refreshed their Adder Pro line with a genuinely striking 2K OLED display in a magnesium aluminum chassis, and updated their Serval WS workstation with Intel's Core Ultra Series 2 processors for people doing serious professional compute work. This isn't a company coasting on one aging product. It's a company actively iterating across an entire lineup at the same pace and with the same seriousness as any major PC manufacturer you'd find at a big box electronics store, except every single one of these machines ships with 0 Windows license, 0 Windows installer, and 0 Windows anywhere in the software stack. Here's the detail that makes this genuinely significant rather than just another laptop. Announcement: System 76 doesn't just sell you generic hardware with a copy of Ubuntu slapped on top and call it a day. They've spent years building their own actual desktop environment called Cosmic, written from the ground up specifically for their machines and now available more broadly across the Linux ecosystem. Building a custom desktop environment is not a small undertaking. It's the kind of deep, sustained software investment that only makes sense if you're planning to be in this business for the long haul, not just flipping cheap hardware with a free operating system thrown in as a cost-cutting measure. That's the tell that separates System 76 from being a curiosity and makes it a genuine proof of concept. This is a company that has bet its entire existence for over 2 decades now on the idea that Windows is not a required ingredient for building and selling excellent premium computers. To put that investment in perspective, building a desktop environment from scratch means designing and maintaining the window manager, the settings panels, the file browser, the notification system, the app launcher, and dozens of other small pieces of software that most computer users never think about individually, but rely on constantly every time they touch their machine. Most hardware companies that dabble in Linux never go anywhere near that level of commitment. They ship a stock version of an existing distribution and consider their job done. System 76 went the opposite direction, rewriting core parts of the desktop. Experience in Rust, a modern security-focused programming language, specifically to make Cosmic fast, stable, and genuinely polished, rather than a rough afterthought. That's not the behavior of a company hedging its bets in case Linux doesn't work out. It's the behavior of a company that decided, years ago, exactly where it was planting its flag, and has been building toward that vision consistently ever since. Now here's where this video's title actually earns its place, and it's worth being precise about what we mean by collapsed. Because this isn't about Microsoft going out of business or Windows disappearing next year. What's actually collapsing is narrower and in some ways more significant than a single company's fortunes. The founding promise itself, that computing requires Microsoft software running underneath it, is the thing that no longer holds up as an unquestioned truth. That promise held up remarkably well for decades. It shaped how software got written, how hardware got designed, how an entire generation of computer users learned to think about what a normal computer even was. System 76 is the walking, shipping, 20 years and counting counterproof to that promise. Evidence that you can build a genuinely excellent, high-performance, professionally competitive computer, sell it to real paying customers year after year, and never once need Windows anywhere in the equation. To be fair, and it's important to be fair here, System 76 is not evidence that Windows is dying, or that Microsoft's business is somehow in trouble because of one Colorado hardware company. Windows still runs on the overwhelming majority of desktop and laptop computers worldwide, and that isn't about to change because of a single premium laptop refresh, however impressive the specs. System 76 operates in a genuine niche: enthusiasts, developers, open source professionals, people who specifically want a machine built around Linux from the ground up rather than one that merely tolerates it. That audience, while growing, is still a fraction of the overall market. Overstating System 76's significance as some kind of existential threat to Windows would be exactly the kind of empty hype this channel tries to avoid. But here's why the niche label doesn't actually make this story less important, just differently important. The value of System 76 isn't market share. It's proof of concept. Every single person who's ever been told that Windows is simply unavoidable, that professional-grade software, serious hardware compatibility, and genuine performance all require Microsoft's operating system sitting somewhere underneath them, has a real, physical shipping counterexample sitting on store shelves right now. That matters enormously at exactly this moment in the broader story we've been tracking on this channel all year. Millions of Windows 10 users have already been forced to confront the question of whether they actually need Windows, following last October's end-of-support deadline. Governments in Germany, Denmark, and Switzerland have been actively building their entire public sector computing infrastructure around Linux instead of Microsoft's ecosystem. And now, on the premium hardware side of the equation, a company with 2 decades of sustained profitability is demonstrating that the founding promise was never actually a technical requirement. It was a market assumption, reinforced by decades of default behavior that's increasingly being tested and found wanting. It's worth being specific about what those government migrations actually involve, because they add real institutional weight to this argument rather than just anecdotal enthusiasm. Germany has spent recent years migrating tens of thousands of official government workstations away from Microsoft software and toward Linux and LibreOffice, with the explicit goal of reducing dependency on any single foreign technology vendor. Denmark has run a parallel initiative across its own public sector. Switzerland went further still, passing legislation requiring publicly funded software development to default to open source licensing, alongside investment in a sovereign national cloud infrastructure built independently of the big American tech platforms. None of these are small pilot programs run by a handful of enthusiastic civil servants. These are large, budget-backed, multi-year commitments made by entire governments, each one implicitly agreeing with the exact premise System 76 has been demonstrating commercially, that a fully functional, professional, government-grade computing environment does not require Windows anywhere in its foundation. It's also worth remembering that Microsoft's dominance over that founding promise wasn't just the product of good software. It drew serious legal scrutiny along the way, precisely because of how completely the company came to control the assumption that Windows was simply unavoidable. In the late 1990s, the US government pursued a major antitrust case against Microsoft, centered on allegations that the company had used its dominant position to squeeze out competing software, most famously by bundling internet. Explore directly into Windows in a way that made it difficult for rival browsers to gain a foothold. The case ultimately resulted in real legal consequences and ongoing oversight of Microsoft's business practices for years afterward. That history matters here because it's a reminder that the founding promise didn't simply succeed on merit alone. It was actively, sometimes aggressively defended through business practices serious enough to draw government intervention. A promise that required that level of active defense to maintain was never quite as naturally inevitable as it might have looked from the outside. It was, in part, engineered to stay that way. The context reframes what's happening with System 76 and the broader Linux hardware ecosystem in an interesting light. For decades, one of the quiet advantages baked into Windows dominance was the sheer difficulty of competing against a company willing and able to use its market position aggressively to protect that dominance. System 76 isn't competing with Microsoft in the antitrust sense at all. It isn't trying to take over the operating system market, sue anyone, or challenge Microsoft's business practices directly. It's simply existing, quietly, on the margins, building excellent hardware year after year, in a market segment small enough that it's never triggered the kind of aggressive, competitive response Microsoft historically reserved for bigger threats. That's part of why this specific kind of erosion is so hard for an incumbent to counter. It's not a frontal challenge you can respond to with the traditional playbook of legal maneuvering or aggressive bundling. It's a slow, patient, 20-year demonstration that quietly accumulates credibility precisely because it never looked threatening enough to provoke a defensive reaction in the first place. It's worth situating System 76 within that broader shift happening across the entire Linux hardware landscape this year too, because they're no longer quite as alone as they used to be. Dell has continued selling its XPS line with Ubuntu pre-installed as an official configuration option, not a hobbyist workaround. Lenovo has expanded official Linux certification and support across parts of its ThinkPad lineup, a brand historically associated almost entirely with corporate Windows deployments. Framework, the increasingly popular modular and repairable laptop maker, ships Linux as a fully supported first-class option across its product range, treating it with the same seriousness as Windows rather than as an afterthought. None of these companies are abandoning Windows as their primary business. Windows still represents the overwhelming majority of units sold across the entire PC industry. But the fact that Linux first and Linux supported hardware has gone from something you had to hunt for on a forum to something major manufacturers actively market and sell is itself a meaningful shift. And System 76 has been quietly laying the groundwork for exactly that shift for longer than almost anyone else in the space. It's worth remembering how genuinely difficult this used to be because it makes System 76's 20-year track record more impressive in hindsight rather than less. For most of Linux's history on the desktop, one of the single biggest practical obstacles wasn't the operating system's software itself. It was hardware compatibility, Wi-Fi cards that didn't have working drivers, trackpads that registered clicks incorrectly, graphics chips that ran without proper acceleration or wouldn't wake up correctly from sleep. Anyone who tried installing Linux on a random Windows laptop from a decade or two ago probably remembers exactly this kind of frustration. The operating system itself working fine, undermined entirely by hardware the manufacturer never tested or optimized for it. System 76's entire founding premise was to solve that specific problem head-on. Build and sell hardware where every single component is chosen and configured specifically to work flawlessly with Linux, rather than hoping generic Windows-oriented hardware happens to cooperate. That's a genuinely different, more deliberate approach than most of the industry took for years, and it's a large part of why their customers report the kind of smooth, plug-and-play experience that used to be considered nearly impossible to find on Linux hardware. That history matters for understanding exactly why this collapse is so slow-moving and so hard to counter with a quick fix. Bad hardware compatibility used to be a genuinely legitimate reason to dismiss Linux as impractical for anyone who wasn't willing to spend a weekend troubleshooting drivers. That excuse has been quietly and steadily dismantled, not through a single dramatic announcement, but through 2 decades of unglamorous, consistent engineering work by companies like System 76, plus growing official support from Dell, Lenovo, and Framework. Each year, that excuse holds less water than the year before. And a company whose entire founding promise depended partly on people not having a comfortable alternative doesn't have a good playbook for responding to an excuse that just keeps quietly getting weaker year after year, with no single moment to point to and directly compete against. There's also a generational dimension to this erosion that's worth naming directly because it suggests the trend isn't likely to reverse on its own. People who grew up with Windows as the unquestioned default learned an entire mental model of computing built around that assumption. Certain keyboard shortcuts, certain file structures, certain expectations about how software gets installed and updated, all quietly shaped by decades of Windows being the only real option most people ever encountered. Younger users entering the workforce today have a meaningfully different relationship with that assumption. Many of them grew up using Chromebooks in school, which run a Linux-based operating system without ever using that name prominently, and increasingly do serious computing work through browser-based tools and cloud services that genuinely don't care what operating system is running underneath them. For a growing share of new computer users, the founding promise was never something they personally experienced as inevitable in the first place. It's simply one option among several they encountered, no more automatically correct than any other. That shift in underlying assumptions, happening quietly at the generational level, is exactly the kind of trend that tends to compound rather than reverse over time. None of this happens through any single decisive moment, which is precisely why quietly collapsed is the right way to describe it rather than something more dramatic. There's no press conference where Microsoft concedes the founding promise no longer holds. There's no single chart that spikes overnight to prove the point beyond argument. Instead, it's System 76, shipping another excellent refresh this year that nobody outside the Linux community pays much attention to. It's another government contract in Europe quietly moving toward open source infrastructure. It's another new computer user raised on Chromebooks who never absorbed the assumption that Windows was simply how computers work in the first place. Individually, none of these moments make headlines. Collectively, over enough years, they add up to exactly the kind of quiet collapse a 50-year-old founding promise doesn't recover from. Precisely because nobody ever has to formally announce that it's over. There's a genuinely interesting business lesson buried in System 76's 20-year survival story too, and it's worth pulling out explicitly because it undercuts a specific argument that's been used against Linux hardware for decades. The idea that nobody would actually pay a real premium price for a computer that doesn't run Windows. System 76's pricing sits squarely in flagship territory, $2,000 and up, not a discount bargain bin machine positioned as cheap because it's missing Windows. Customers are paying full premium price, specifically because they want the hardware quality and the Linux native software experience together, not because they're settling for something lesser to save money. That's a meaningfully different business model than Linux as the budget option, and it's exactly the model that proves genuine Sustained customer demand exists for premium computing entirely outside Microsoft's ecosystem. Demand strong enough to fund 2 decades of continuous product development, including building an entire custom desktop environment from scratch. It's also worth noting who's actually buying these machines, because the customer base tells its own part of the story. System76's audience skews heavily toward developers, system administrators, data scientists, and other technically sophisticated professionals. Exactly the kind of buyers who have the most reason to be price sensitive about wasted licensing costs, and the most technical knowledge to genuinely evaluate whether an alternative to Windows can actually hold up under serious daily use. These aren't casual buyers picking Linux because it sounded interesting in a video. They're professionals whose actual livelihood depends on their machine working reliably, running demanding software, and not getting in their way. The fact that this specific discerning audience keeps coming back to System76 year after year, refresh after refresh, paying full premium price the entire time is about as strong a signal of genuine product quality as a company in this space could hope to demonstrate. So what does quietly collapsed actually mean in the context of all this, since we should be precise rather than hyperbolic about the claim? It doesn't mean Windows is disappearing, or that Microsoft's revenue is collapsing, or that most people are about to abandon Windows en masse next year. What it means is narrower, and in some ways more significant for a company built entirely around one founding assumption: the specific cultural belief that Windows is simply unavoidable. The default nobody seriously questions, the water that computing fish don't even notice they're swimming in, is the thing that quietly stops holding up. Once a large enough population of people has directly seen, whether through a company like System76, a government migration in Europe, or their own frustrated experience with Windows 11's hardware requirements, that a genuinely excellent computing experience is possible without Windows anywhere in the picture. That specific unquestioned default status becomes very hard to fully restore. You can lose market share and gain it back. It's much harder to fully restore a founding promise. Once enough, people have personally seen it proven optional rather than necessary. There's a reason this particular kind of erosion tends to worry incumbents more than a direct competitive loss would. A company can respond to losing market share with a better product, a price cut, a marketing push. Those are all familiar, well-understood playbooks. It's much harder to respond to a slow erosion of a founding promise, because the thing being lost isn't a specific sale or a specific customer. It's the automatic, unexamined assumption that made every sale easy in the first place. System76 isn't taking customers away from Microsoft through aggressive competition. It's just quietly existing year after year, as proof that the founding promise was never actually load-bearing in the way it once seemed. That's a much harder problem to solve, precisely because there's no single competitive move that restores a promise once enough people have started questioning it out loud. If you've ever looked at Linux hardware and assumed you'd have to settle for weaker specs or a worse build quality compared to a mainstream Windows machine, System76's 2026 lineup is worth an honest look. The Lemur Pro alone stacks up against flagship ultra-portables costing the same or more. And if you want to see the full picture of why so, many people are questioning that founding promise in the first place this year. I've got the full breakdown of the Windows 10 migration wave linked right here, along with the other stories we've covered about Microsoft's own products quietly underserving Linux users at every turn. The Teams lockout, the secure boot certificate mess, Copilot's broken sidebar on Edge for Linux. Taken together, they paint a much clearer picture of exactly how a 50-year-old promise starts quietly falling apart than any single story does on its own. Subscribe if you want to keep watching exactly how much of that founding promise keeps getting tested and keeps not holding up.